Step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. These are his words. Let's begin. Campaign in Saxony, 1813. The brief time I spent in Paris during the winter of 1813 left me with sombre and lasting memories. I found my family, friends, and society as a whole struck with terror. The infamous 29th Bulletin had suddenly revealed to France the destruction of the Grande Armée. The Emperor was no longer invincible. While we were succumbing in Russia, another army was slowly perishing in Spain, and in Paris itself, an obscure conspirator had nearly seized power. The campaign of 1813 was about to begin, and under what circumstances? Prussia's defection was no longer in doubt, Austria's alliance was at best uncertain, and France's exhaustion was growing in proportion to the number of its enemies. The accounts from officers who had escaped the horrors of the retreat only heightened the fear. Paris, accustomed for 15 years to the sounds of victory, learned daily with painful surprise the details of yet another public or private calamity. The carnival festivities ceased. Everyone retreated into their homes, preoccupied with present misfortunes and future anxieties. Amid this general consternation, people were shocked to see the Emperor hosting lavish events at the Tuileries. It was seen as an insult to public sorrow and a cruel display of insensitivity to so many victims. I will never forget one of these grim balls, where it seemed to me as though people were dancing on tombstones. However, the Emperor used his time in Paris admirably and in a way befitting his genius. History will recount the new army that arose at his command and the brilliant successes that followed so many defeats. As early as February, a senatus consulte placed 350,000 men at the Minister of War's disposal, drawn from conscriptions over several years and the first levy of the National Guard, which had been organized into cohorts in early 1812. These forces were used to create 34 new infantry regiments. This massive recruitment effort was bolstered by voluntary contributions of men and horses. Large cities and provinces vied in zeal, driven not just by fear or flattery, but also by a revived sense of national pride. France sought to make one final effort to secure an honourable peace. 10,000 young men, self-equipped at their own expense, formed a cavalry reserve under the name of Guards of Honour. 4 observation corps were established along the Elbe, in Illyria, and on the Rhine. Depot battalions were deployed in full or by companies. Battalion or squadron cadres were recalled from Spain, along with several regiments of the Young Guard. 3,000 gendarmerie officers and non-commissioned officers were transferred to the line infantry. Naval artillery regiments were converted into infantry regiments. Supplies from arsenals and fortresses were requisitioned, and remounts were ordered in France and Germany. Amid this grand military mobilization, my regiment occupied all my thoughts. My days were spent advocating for rewards for my officers, who had so often earned them under my eyes, as well as advantageous pensions for those no longer fit to serve. I filled the many vacant posts with officers I knew and trusted, and I prepared to return to my depot in Nancy to oversee the regiment's reorganization. One day, Count de Narbonne, the Emperor's aide-de-camp, told the Duke of Feltre that I should be promoted to brigadier general. My father-in-law replied that I had been a colonel for less than 6 months, and that he would never make such an indiscreet request. Count de Narbonne, undeterred, went directly to the Emperor and suggested that, since the Emperor had seemed pleased with me, I should be tested in a higher position. Jokingly, he added that it wouldn't be a great risk, and one more bad brigadier general wouldn't ruin the army. Marshal Ney, called as a witness, kindly assured the Emperor that even this slight risk was not present. A few days later, my father-in-law informed me of my appointment, which surprised him as much as it did me. Those who knew the Duke of Feltre's disinterestedness will not be surprised by his conduct. It is rare for a minister of war to leave the advancement of his son-in-law to others. I was flattered by this noble recognition of my zeal, but it was not without regret that I relinquished my regiment and the cherished uniform that came with it. I was assigned to the 5th Corps, commanded by General Lauriston in Magdeburg, and left immediately to join it. I stopped in Nancy at the 4th Regiment Depot. The cadres I had left at Custrin had just arrived there. The officers gave me a dinner to celebrate my promotion and bid me farewell. I left with a heavy heart, knowing all too well that for many of them this farewell would be eternal. At the 4th Regiment, I left a surplus of 45,000 francs. At that time, the large influx of men into the regiments and the extensive purchases and equipment overseen by administrative councils allowed for considerable savings without compromising the soldiers' needs. These funds had always been contested, but they were an immense resource when managed with integrity and intelligence. During my short tenure, I only used them to provide 100 francs to each officer returning from Russia and 200 francs to each senior officer. Unfortunately, these valuable savings were entirely squandered by one of my successors. I hold an eternal grudge against him in silence, taking solace in not naming him here. I continued my journey through Mainz, Kassel and Brunswick, and joined General Lauriston in Magdeburg. It is beyond my scope to recount in detail the army's movements during my absence. After the departure of the King of Naples in January, the Viceroy took command of these grim remnants at Posen, weakened further by the garrisons left in various strongholds and by the withdrawal of the Austrians, who returned to Galicia. The Viceroy displayed courage and skill, continuing his retreat without allowing the enemy to break his forces and containing the increasingly hostile sentiments of Prussia, whose disposition his frail army barely managed to intimidate. He successively abandoned the lines of the Warta, the Oder, Berlin, and all of Prussia to take a position behind the Elbe. At that point, 50,000 men were assembled. The Russians, who had been ravaged by typhus for several months, had at most 60,000. However, the Prussians had just joined them. Their reinforcements and ours were arriving at forced marches. The Emperor was expected, and we were on the verge of significant events. It was along the banks of the Elbe or the Saale that the fate of Europe would be decided. General Lauriston placed me in General Maison's division, the first of his army corps. This division consisted of only 3 regiments, the 151st, 152nd, and 153rd, all of recent formation. Furthermore, the 152nd had been detached to Bremen. I was therefore at risk of being left without a role unless I could secure the Viceroy's permission to go to Bremen myself, take command of the 152nd, and bring it back as soon as it was no longer needed in that region. This mission, which temporarily distanced me from the Grande Armée, led me to participate in the Hamburg campaign, which I will now recount. From the year 1810, Napoleon annexed the territory of the Hanseatic cities into the Empire under the name of the 32nd Military Division. This measure was necessary to complete the continental blockade, but it outraged all the inhabitants. Their pride was deeply wounded. The continental blockade and the confiscation of English goods ruined trade. Nowhere was Napoleon's yoke more odious, and his colossal power extinguished any hope of ever escaping it. The disasters of 1812, so rapid and unforeseen, seemed like a miracle of Providence in their favour. Rumours exaggerated these events. The most absurd news was welcomed by those whose hopes they fuelled. The army was destroyed. The Emperor had fled alone, disguised as a peasant. Prussia and Austria had joined Russia, and all of Germany was rising up. These stories caused widespread unrest. It remained manageable as long as the enemy did not appear, and the position of the army on the Elbe was supposed to protect Hamburg from this danger. However, instead of defending this critical point, the Viceroy completely abandoned the lower Elbe and stationed his troops between Dresden and Magdeburg. Whatever his reasons, the outcome was disastrous. General Tettenborn advanced on Hamburg along the right bank of the Elbe, driving before him General Morand, who was stationed in Swedish Pomerania. Tettenborn's force soon grew with insurgent peasants, Mecklenburgers, and some Prussians, who did not wait for their king's declaration of war. Meanwhile, the English landed at the mouths of the Elbe and Weser rivers, seized the forts and batteries at Bremerlehe and Blexen, and incited the local population to rise. The insurrection became widespread and even erupted in the middle of Hamburg, where General Cara Saint-Cyr was in command. It was suppressed, and the leaders paid for it with their lives. The resulting outrage increased, and General Cara Saint-Cyr, surrounded by threats, believed he could not hold Hamburg. He has been criticized for this, but he had only 1,000 men, almost no artillery, and nothing prepared for defense. Everything had been sent to the Grande Armée. And who could have foreseen, in October, when the Emperor controlled Moscow, that by the following February it would be necessary to fight on the Elbe and Weser? Cara Saint-Cyr thus abandoned Hamburg on March 12, 1813. Morand crossed the Elbe at Zollenspicke and joined him at Altenburg. They stopped at Lüneburg and Cara Saint-Cyr at Bremen. Together, they could barely assemble 2,000 men. Tettenborn entered Hamburg, and the reception he received can be imagined. Women embraced the Cossacks' horses and the Cossacks themselves, which was equally extraordinary. People competed for the honour of hosting officers and even soldiers. The old government was reinstated, the port reopened to English goods, and the inhabitants gave everything they had to support the war effort. A Hanseatic legion was formed, and all the young men enlisted. General Cara Saint-Cyr, stationed at Bremen, tried to regain control. A column he sent between the Elbe and Weser drove the English out of Blexen. Over 200 armed peasants lost their lives there. However, at the same time, General Morand was surrounded at Lüneburg by Generals Dornberg and Birkendorf and was captured along with all his troops. It is easy for 4,000 men to defeat 1,000, but for us, the loss was significant, and the moral impact was even worse. Our troops were intimidated, while the confidence of the enemy and the insurgents grew. Already, this war was taking on the character of a war of principles on the part of the Allies. The inhabitants of Hanover had taken up arms, and severe measures were being prepared against them. General Dornberg wrote to the French generals, stating that the Hanoverians had only obeyed the orders of the Emperor of Russia by arming themselves for their legitimate sovereign, the King of England, and that French prisoners would answer for how they were treated. Russia had quickly forgotten the Treaty of Erfurt, by which it had recognized the King of Westphalia as the sovereign of Hanover. This setback made our position in Bremen as critical as it had been in Hamburg, and there was little choice but to consider abandoning it. Such a move would have been even more disastrous. The insurrection would have spread to Hanover and all of Westphalia, cutting off the Grand Army's communication line with the Rhine. The consequences of such a show of weakness were incalculable. Another general arrived just in time to prevent this from happening. From the first signs of danger, the Emperor had directed all available forces from the northern departments to Bremen. The army corps forming at Wesel received the same orders, and General Van Damme was given command. No one was better suited to a war of this nature. From the early campaigns of the Revolution, he had distinguished himself by his brilliant courage, tireless activity, military expertise, intelligence, and ambition. Unfortunately, these qualities were accompanied by a violent and insubordinate character. He was even accused of overly harsh actions during the first wars of the Revolution. However, I believe he was more hot-tempered than malicious. I even knew him to have endearing qualities. He was a good husband, a devoted father, and a loyal friend. His advancement had not matched his talents or services. His unyielding character worked against him with the Emperor. "Truly," Napoleon said, "I could not have two Van Dammes. They would fight until one killed the other." Van Damme attributed the advantages given to his peers solely to injustice and intrigue, which made him bitter. In 1812, he commanded the Westphalians under King Jerome, sharing in his disgrace. Upon returning to Paris, the Emperor recalled him, treated him well, and gave him command of the troops assigned to the 32nd Military Division. This crucial position rekindled his old enthusiasm. He believed the time had come to earn the Marshal's baton and the title of Duke he had long coveted. In this optimistic frame of mind, I found him in Bremen, where we arrived simultaneously. I spent an evening talking with him, or rather listening to him, as that was how our conversations typically unfolded. His plan was clear: to hold Bremen at all costs, to maintain an imposing stance, to operate boldly in the field, and to compensate for our small numbers with activity and audacity until the arrival of reinforcements would allow us to attack Hamburg. One will see with what vigour he executed this plan. But first, I must say a word about my personal situation and the composition of the troops. The Army Corps under General Vandamme was supposed to consist of the divisions commanded by Cara Saint-Cyr, Dufour, and Dumonceau, numbering more than 20,000 men. At the time, however, barely 4,000 men were gathered in Bremen. Here is the composition. The 152nd Regiment, reduced to 3 battalions, as the 4th had been captured along with General Morand. This regiment, formed from cohorts, consisted of soldiers in their prime, generally tall and well-built. However, in organising so many new units at once, it had been necessary to enlist officers of all ranks who were either retired or in reserve. One can imagine the physical and moral composition of such a corps of officers. The second lieutenants, fresh out of Fontainebleau, were novices, and apart from a few honourable exceptions, the other officers were ignorant, worn out, or dull. 2 battalions of customs officers, who were excellent soldiers, and 1 battalion of sailors, remarkable for their discipline as well as their bravery. Finally, 2 marching battalions formed from companies drawn from the depots of various regiments, a poor organisation that lacked cohesion but was necessitated by circumstances. General Cara Saint-Cyr commanded this small division, with the Prince of Reuss and me as brigadier generals. The Prince of Reuss, from the sovereign house of that name, was a young colonel in the service of France. His outstanding military merit had earned him this position, which was superior to his rank. He had previously served in the Austrian army as an aide-de-camp to Archduke Charles, and traces of his German habits could be seen in the slowness of his preparations. However, when the time came for action, nothing equalled his energy, intelligence, and keen judgment. His manners were pleasant, and his character was amiable and easygoing. Meeting him was a stroke of good fortune for me. From the first day he showed me kindness and interest. I valued cultivating this budding friendship, formed on the front lines, which his glorious death would sadly cut short too soon. My appointment as general had been so unexpected, and my departure for the army so swift, that I had no time to find an aide-de-camp. Before leaving Paris, my cousin, Madame Dudetau, asked me to take her son, Monsieur Franz Dudetau, a young and already distinguished officer. He had served in the Russian campaign as a captain on the staff of the First Corps and remained in the army with Prince d'Eckmühl. I left with his commission and found him in Bremen. Unfortunately, Prince d'Eckmühl had requested him at the same time. I regretfully yielded him, and circumstances later showed that this arrangement was a loss for him as well. I would undoubtedly have secured his promotion to squadron leader at the Emperor's Review in July, during the armistice, enabling him to campaign in his new rank. Instead, having been confined in Hamburg with Prince d'Eckmühl, his advancement was greatly delayed. In the meantime, I provisionally took as my aide-de-camp a second lieutenant from the 152nd Regiment named Chabrand. He was from an excellent family in Pignerol and had just graduated from military school. I have never encountered someone so inexperienced, nor anything as amusing as the contrast between his ignorance and his lively Piedmontese temperament. Initially, he was of little use, and served only to try my patience. However, his good heart and willingness endeared him to me, and I eventually decided to keep him by my side. Our small army departed Bremen on April 2nd, spending 15 days marching back and forth. On April 7th, Cara Saint-Cyr was in Rothenburg, while I was at the front lines in Schiessel, 10 leagues from Hamburg. We remained there for 3 days without any sign of the enemy. This deceptive calm foreshadowed a serious attack. General Cara Saint-Cyr received intelligence of this and decided to retreat, with me always covering the rear. Immediately after his departure, 30 gendarmes he had imprudently left in Rothenburg were captured by the Cossacks, who harassed me incessantly in the following days. It is well known that the Cossacks never attack a vigilant force. However, they excel at exploiting even the slightest negligence, and mistakes in their presence go unpunished for very little time. I was familiar with this type of warfare and did not fear them. They contented themselves with following me to the gates of Bremen. The division took position on April 15th, with the right flank at Achim anchored on the Weser River, and the left flank at Thedinghausen on the road to Hamburg, with marshes crossing this route in front of the line. General Vandamme angrily rebuked General Cara Saint-Cyr, criticizing him harshly. "I have never seen two generals more incompatible." The fiery valour of the former clashed entirely with the cautious prudence of the latter. In this instance, however, the retreat was the correct decision. General Benkendorf had left Hamburg with the Hanseatic Legion, a large corps of Cossacks, and some artillery. Simultaneously, General Dornberg returned to Lüneburg, occupied Celle, and advanced his vanguard as far as Warden. General Cara Saint-Cyr was left isolated on the road to Hamburg with 3,000 men, 12 leagues from Bremen. A retreat was preferable to a defeat, especially given the local conditions. On April 16th, the Prince of Reuss drove the Cossacks out of Warden after a sharp skirmish. Shortly afterward, General Sebastiani, who commanded the left wing of the Grande Armée, re-entered Celle and pushed Dornberg back across the Aller River. To support this movement, Vandamme ordered a strong reconnaissance mission toward Rothenburg. General Saint-Cyr sent me forward with 4 battalions, cautioning me not to advance too far. On April 22nd, I encountered the Cossacks ahead of Ottersberg, driving them back to their infantry stationed behind the town, which then retreated to the Wümme River. There, skirmishes broke out, and the enemy eventually withdrew in good order to a point about a league beyond Rothenburg. The enemy halted there, showing over 2,000 infantry, 2 squadrons of cavalry, and some artillery. I reported this to General Saint-Cyr, who had held back the Reuss brigade at Sottrum, 2 leagues behind. This brigade consisted of several battalions of sailors and customs officers. I assured him that an attack by the entire division would succeed and allow us to capture Rothenburg. The Prince of Reuss agreed, but the general refused. He believed that, given the local population's hostility, even a minor failure would have disastrous consequences, and it was better to wait for reinforcements to ensure victory. Shortly thereafter, he left the army. I have only good things to say about my interactions with him. Meanwhile, reinforcements were arriving from all sides, and the government's measures corresponded to the deployment of military forces. On April 10th, a senatus consulte suspended the constitutional regime in the 32nd Military Division. The commanding general-in-chief was given extensive powers over high policing. These included drafting necessary regulations with the application of penalties from the penal code, temporarily suspending and replacing civil authorities, imposing extraordinary contributions, taking hostages if needed, and enacting other war-authorized measures. The appointment of Prince Deckmühl only added to the severity of these measures. No one was better suited than he to rigorously execute such strict instructions and to broadly interpret their discretionary aspects. He hastened to arrive in Bremen. General Vandamme remained in charge of troop command. One can imagine Vandamme's dissatisfaction at being under the orders of a marshal. This resulted in constant friction, which might have harmed the efficiency of the service if not for the patience of Prince Deckmühl. One day, Vandamme arrived at his residence, red with anger, and without greeting the prince, began a violent scene in the presence of the Prince of Reuss and myself. He raged about the marshal having written directly to one of the generals under his command, saying, When a marshal has the honor of commanding a general like me, he owes me respect. I refuse to serve under these conditions. From this moment, I am no longer under his orders." Prince d'Eckmühl barely managed to explain himself. He sent General Laville, his chief of staff, to try and calm Vandamme, and merely said to us with some embarrassment, "Gentlemen, one must learn to endure for the service of the Emperor." Some time before, Napoleon had written to him, "Take care to handle Vandamme with caution. Experienced soldiers are becoming rare." The recommendation arrived just in time and proved effective. The time had come to take the offensive seriously, and the assembly of troops in Bremen was meant to guarantee success. Besides our division, now commanded by an elderly Dutch general, the Dufour division occupied Bremen, and the Dumonceau division joined us on the right. Together, these forces numbered about 18,000 to 20,000 men. On April 26th, we advanced. The Prince of Reuss took the vanguard, my brigade marched in the second line, and our new general followed us rather than commanding us. He was a Dutch soldier, ignorant and coarse, incapable of taking any initiative. I cannot understand why General Carré-Saint-Cyr was replaced with someone so inferior in every respect. The enemy's skirmishers offered weak resistance at Ottersberg and the Vist stream near Sottrum. As we emerged into the plain, we found their infantry arrayed in battle formation with some artillery. I moved into position and took the left of the road. We barely had 4,000 men without cavalry. We formed columns for attack, and without responding to the enemy artillery, we advanced at a charge. The enemy did not wait for the clash and retreated, pursued by us until we entered Rottenburg that evening, still fighting. Our casualties were light, and this initial success filled our young soldiers with enthusiasm. I have only praise for the Prince of Reuss, who throughout the day showed me as much respect as if I commanded the division. For my part, I did not seek to assert the superiority of my rank. We acted as equals without pretension or pride, and were satisfied to share the honour of the day. I dare say it is unfortunate that such conduct did not serve as a model for other generals in more critical situations. Rothenburg was slightly looted. It is a disorder that is difficult to prevent in a town entered by force after a tiring day and amid the intoxication of a first victory. Whatever the case, the disorder persisted the following morning when Prince d'Eckmühl and General Vandamme arrived. The latter ignored it, but Prince d'Eckmühl, who abhorred looting, severely reprimanded us. Catching a conscript and a customs officer in the act, he declared that examples must be made, and that it was necessary to execute one of them. A lottery was held, and it fell on the customs officer, who was shot on the spot. He was a family man who had joined the army only the day before. The need to restore discipline does not justify an execution without trial, where the will of a man substitutes for the rule of law. While rebellion, cowardice, or cruelty towards civilians might warrant such actions, generals must never forget that such measures are crimes unless absolutely required. On April 27th, the division reached Schießel. On the 28th, it arrived at Tostedt. The Prince of Reuss pursued the enemy to the outskirts of Harburg, located on the left bank of the Elbe River. A company of light infantry from the 152nd Regiment was the first to arrive at the rampart. Second Lieutenant Ruhl used a spar he found to cross the moat and lower the drawbridge. The fort was taken. Our division and the Dufour division regrouped at Harburg. Meanwhile, the Dumonceau division advanced on our right towards Zollenspicke. 2 English vessels were captured, and the speed of these initial successes assured us of the capture of Hamburg, which was delayed only by the diplomatic considerations of our political situation with Denmark. Denmark, bound to France by a mutual guarantee treaty, was viewed with suspicion by the Allies. After the capture of Hamburg, its position became precarious. The Danish king consulted Napoleon, who candidly replied that, unable to protect Denmark at that moment, he authorized the king to accede to any demands necessary for the safety of his state. Russia first demanded that Denmark defend Hamburg against France, and a Danish division entered the city. However, the Allies' true aim was to secure the cession of Norway, and they did not hesitate to demand it. France, for its part, began negotiations with Denmark for an offensive and defensive alliance. Thus, it was in our interest to avoid taking action against the Danish division in Hamburg. This period of respite was used to bring in artillery, fortify Harburg, and prepare for attacks on the islands separating Hamburg from Harburg. The Dumonceau division remained on the right along the Elbe River up to Weinze. The Dufour division and the Reuss brigade stayed at Harburg with the commanding general. I was stationed in observation at Marburg, 1 league from Harburg, on the left. That concludes the 17th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.